They gave an introduction to us, and I'm always quite shy of the things that they say, but I just also want to say, Chandan was my professor when I was a teenager at the National Law School in Bangalore about 17 years ago. And as a teenager who was very determined to not pay attention in class, I want to say Chandan's classes made it very difficult. So I ended up developing a love for sociology against my wishes as a teenager, and I'm always very grateful to you for that. And I'm quite excited to be talking to you about this book, which I have been so completely immersed in over the last couple of weeks.
Thank you, Amshyla. Amshyla, a compliment for a compliment, really. As a student, any one of you who has taught Srilata is here, Sharbila is here, you will know that in a class of bright students, they all hand in good papers, but a few papers simply stand out in ways that you can't even ignore. You simply can't. And Amshyla's papers were like that. So, and effortless. He was smiling, and oh, there is another student of mine. Also in that category, actually. Bhargavi, yes, hi.
Yeah, so I just want to get right into it because we don't have that much time, and the book has covers so many fascinating aspects that we'll just begin. So there's a word that is almost impossible to stop hearing, right? Development. So wherever you are, in Mysore these days, they say, "Nam area tumba develop agoitu," which to translate it means our area became very developed, without ever questioning what that word actually means, right? We use it 100 times a day. A politician has developed a town or failed to do so. Somebody has developed a town because there's an airport and a flyover there. There is almost no political party that can afford to be against the idea of development, but we've never possibly stopped to ask what it means, and we've never asked anyone to justify it. So Chandan's book starts by making that word strange again, in a sense, and it has two surprises in it. The first is that the obsession with the word is not new, and it is not ours alone. It did not begin in, say, 1947, like most of us might assume with Nehru or the 5-year plans. It began here, actually, in the princely state of Mysore, more than half a century before that. Right? The second surprise actually goes a bit deeper, which is that the engine of all of it, contrary to what many scholars have written about, is not economics, but it's closer to a longing, and it is closer to the longing for a cultural recognition. It is a longing to be recognized as civilized, which is measured against a West that is always a little bit out of reach. And the lab for it was the state of Mysore. So Chandan is someone who went away to study to Michigan, and this book has actually been in the making for the better part of over 2 decades. So I just want to ask you, what was the seed for the idea? What was a crack in the obvious that make you want to look at development? And did being away change the perspective of how you would have looked at it otherwise? Sorry, there are many questions, but...
Thank you. I'm sure actually my being at Michigan had a lot to do with how the book came to be. I was in a sociology department, and we had a very strong historical sociology concentration, which allowed you for some interpretive work. It's not this positivist, quantitative modeling work. And I thought, okay, I wanted to work on Mysore. And everyone in that program had worked on the state. Actually, the English state, the German state, the French state. And I felt, okay, if I want to look at Mysore, because it's been understudied, princely India has been understudied within the larger Indian context. And the developmental state within the literature on the state had been understudied. In cultural terms, you have most studies of the developmental state are of a political economy kind. They just presume that here is a state that wants to encourage capital accumulation, and how does it succeed, when does it succeed, that kind of a thing. Korea, all these East Asian models, etc. So yeah, so there was this multi-dimensional sort of justification that I found for this work. And even within Karnataka studies, you have studies of Tipu Sultan, you have studies of Mysure's music, the wrestling traditions, but not quite this. You have, biographical accounts of various Diwans and Maharajas, but not this. By this I mean, the pre-Nehruvian episode with planning that we had, which goes back several decades. And again, a reason for why Mysore has been neglected is, it was very quickly decided that these people are collaborators with the British. There's no national movement here. Princely India is an embarrassment as a result. So you just quietly don't talk about it. But of course, they've signed a treaty that is self-subordinating in so many ways. But did that make them only and purely and wholly collaborators is a question to ask. I think there was a lot of other things they were doing besides, including, having a role in the freedom movement outside, if you want those sorts of things. And Gandhi was a state guest several times, despite the British objections to it. Tagore came here, all kinds of big Indian figures came here. And Mysore, as we know, was something that a lot of Indian nationalists were constantly fond of pointing to as a state that showed Indians could govern themselves quite well if left to themselves. And there was a lot of this going on. And so part of this book is intellectual history, where you try to say what did they mean by development and where did those ideas come from. And part of it is what then did that matter for how they went about doing their economic activities or other sort of institution building work. Yeah.
I want to ask you about the title. It says longing for an elsewhere. It's quite evocative. What is the longing for and what is the elsewhere?
Yeah. The elsewhere at that time is quite simply the West, the undifferentiated West. If you look at it, sometimes they're giving examples from the US or Germany or Italy, but it's broadly some notion of a unified something called the West. And it is not an ironic comparison, it is quite literal, because the idea that history was headed in one direction and the question of us moving there, was so strong, was so completely strong. That was the elsewhere. And there was an elsewhere like Japan, for example, that was pointing to them that, a nation country could also, defeat Russia, become military powerful, economically powerful, that sort of a thing. But it was a theoretical sort of a conviction about how the historical movement is univariate. I mean, there's no variation in how it unfolds. They're already pointing towards where we need to go. So, when all of this is happening, 95% of Mysore is in villages. But still, someone like Vishweshwaraya will say we need to do something quick about this, bring them to cities, etc. And that is something you even heard people like Chandrababu Naidu saying, like 2 or 3 decades ago, that we need to move out people. And even now the Niti Aayog people speak the same language of how the surplus population from villages needs to be moved out, reskilled, and made part of the service class in the new cities, etc. It's really, but is it the same imagination? I don't think it is. But the sense that rural India cannot have a place for itself and on its own terms, that seems to have been a foregone conclusion. Actually, someone of whom I will not name, who's a big sort of person in Bangalore, he was saying it's a national embarrassment that so many of our workforce is in the rural sector. And so this is Arun is here.
Yeah, sorry. And what is the longing? If you can talk about what the longing was for.
Yeah, the longing was to, you're right, mimicry is a tense project. I mean, you want to mimic something and it's always elusive. It's never perfect mimicry. You're constantly in a state of dissatisfaction that you've not quite, reproduced the same thing. But in a rough sense, in a statistical imagination, you're talking of, population figures being redistributed. But in concrete sort of material images of infrastructure, etc., you're thinking of high-speed cars, roads, telecommunications, that time, postal services and railways, and these sorts of communicative things.
I want to read a paragraph from the beginning of the book. And the chapter is called Revisiting the Developmental State. Bangalore has seen a lot of development, sir. The driver initiated a conversation inside his auto rickshaw in Bangalore a few years ago. I asked him what he meant. Flyovers, he explained. More recently, while I was waiting my turn in a neighborhood hair salon, I got chatting about local politics with a youth sitting across me. At some point, he said, people say Deve Gowda has developed Hassan, but he has done nothing for the town. It doesn't even have an airport. Development is doubtless the zeitgeist of contemporary India. The Indian state's priorities for the present and the future are debated on the basis of their conformity to the promise of development, a term that can imply shiny 8-line highways, fast trains, digital transactions, and shopping malls, as well as literacy and solar parks development manages to touch one chord or another across millions of Indians. Riding on telegraphic slogans, images, and metaphors, it chases doubts to a distance. Everyone must want development. No political party can risk being labeled anti-development. This book is about the colonial ancestry of the contemporary obsession with development in India. So Chandan, I want to ask, you did mention that there were alternatives. You mentioned Gandhi, you mentioned Tagore. Can you tell us a little bit more about that, as well as what alternatives existed from within the region itself, from within the Mysore region, that the elite could have possibly looked at but ignored?
See, one of the fatal things about development planning is that they work with standardized models in an over-centralized sense. And there's a total conviction that it will surely be executed properly. So this is not even the execution problem, it's a conception problem. How do you think of... So there's a total, a certain paternalism about the whole thing, that you do know what's best for the country, and there's no need really to listen to anybody else. And this is a good faith hubris. I don't think there's any sense of that there's any connivance here. You genuinely feel you are forearmed with a certain knowledge about the state of the world and where it's headed, and you want to act in the best interest. But Gandhi is an example, and he and Vishweshwaraya have an exchange of letters. And here is Vishweshwaraya who sends him a quotation from Stalin, a quotation from Mussolini, a quotation from somebody else, completely in an ideological fashion, talking about how all of them want a certain kind of industrial production. Right? And Gandhi says, my heart weeps when I see young Indians write like this. That's his response, comment to it. So the question of alternatives, you had a certain, I don't know, you did have a cooperative movement of a kind that the state itself encouraged to give credit in rural areas. That's not strictly an alternative. They're enabling them to shift to the system that they feel is a better one. I don't know if, the alternative in the national level, the grand civilizational alternative, Gandhi's Gram Swaraj, was there, or it came to evolve later on. But even that, I would be somewhat wary of, because the cities may not be particularly amenable to it. But the alternative question, there's a peasant protest that I talk about. So you get a glimpse of how a certain irrigation scheme, after the KRS was built, there was an irrigation scheme that Vishweshwaraya tried to push in the Irvin Canal area. It was very simple. He was saying, let's have triennial rotation of crops with 3 different amounts of water supply. He simply had a grid in mind with water supply being managed in strictly rational terms. And you had S.M. Krishna's father, S.C. Mallaya, in the Mysore Representative Assembly, showing how that scheme was impractical at every possible level. The land ownership pattern was different, the way livestock was managed was different, all of that.
And what that led to,
so if they had listened to him, maybe the scheme would have been different. So this is not a complete refusal of any such thing as a plan. It's really a plea for listening carefully to what they need and a consultative sort of moving ahead.
And
even these, I feel, I frankly, I also say in some part of the book, we have alternative development, sustainable development, all kinds of alternate, prefixes to the word development, but I think they're all in the same trap of somehow managing a movement. The fact of non-movement, if you will, or just, doing things another way without being wedded to some larger end, just doesn't exist.
You say it very elegantly in the book. You say the theory has a power over which resists reality, actually. Though we have seen many of these fail, there's a rather than questioning the theory itself, we are recommitting to and digging our heels just to the theory, right? So in the book you mention how the irrigation scheme led to waterlogging and the soil becoming salty. But still there was no deviation from the theory itself. They doubled down on it. You also mention that you talk about D.R. Nagaraj and how he is referring to mystics in Karnataka. If you could speak a little bit about those ideas that were existing but were largely ignored by the elite.
This was a somewhat, the discussion she refers to was about the othering thing. We presume that there's the colonizer and the colonized, and everyone is othering each other. But DR was saying, what explains the silence of the mystics, if you will, around the 19th century? We have a whole host of figures who simply are indifferent to the existence of colonial power. And his reasoning was based on Kaivara Tataya's example from near Chikbalapura, was that they saw political power like nature. It can be friendly at times, it can be cruel at times, and they didn't differentiate between the British power as especially different than any other kind of power. And I think it's a hypothesis to think with, actually. I mean, in that level, and you have folk tales, folk songs rather, early about Monroe, praising him. And nowhere does the fact that he's a British is being registered anywhere. I think it's something that we need some serious probing into. The British may have othered us in their mind, but did we get into the game? Some of us did, clearly did. But I don't think it explains the relationship of many other levels straight off Indian society with the British.
And I think you mentioned somewhere that they looked at the state almost like looking at nature. Sometimes it is beastly, sometimes it is benign. So they looked at the rulers of Mysore very similar to how they looked at the British. That was, it's, you never realize that, it's... So, Chandan, again, the book, what stood out in the book for me was this idea of shame that the elites felt, right? So, if you can talk a little bit about what that longing was, what the shame was. Sorry, I'm coming back to this question because to me, it feels like it's the crux of the book because I also see it in a contemporary sense. There's a deeply internalized shame and an idea of the West that we have to forever catch up to. And this idea of us having been backward even before we were poor, actually.
Thank you, Amshyla. There's a philosopher, Bernard Williams, has a book called Shame and Necessity, and where he describes shame as being seen by the wrong people in a wrongful condition. And I felt the acceptance of the elite, not just in Mysore, but across India, that they were backward. It's one thing for the British to say you're backward. It's another for the other to say, yes, you're right, we are backward. Now, that required a sort of a compact or a contract or a pact that indeed history is like this and civilizations advance in this fashion and we are indeed backward. So once you subscribe to that kind of historical thinking, are you then, able to say, yes, we need to develop and let's do this. And, you just assume a certain agency, an epic uplift agency, as it were, from those things. And, spectacularly, Gandhi was the one who really stayed out of this entire discussion. I actually tried to reframe the whole thing as forget the external world. Civilizations are not to be sorted on criterion of the material world. It's about, civilization show to you one's duty, which is not exclusive to any one civilization. But then you are not sorting out civilizations as progressive and backward or primitive or whatever.
And the same kind of shame was not felt by the literary elite, for example, who embraced Shakespeare, like you mentioned somewhere in the book, right? So what do you think was the reason that this was felt, say, by Vishveshwaraya and not, Kuvempu?
Yeah, because Vishveshwaraya is obsessed with redesigning or reconstructing the economy. So he's seeing everything as inadequate. The whole thing seems like a massive problem that might never ever get resolved in his lifetime, at least. He wants to, right? But Kuvempu is on a different footing. If he's writing a poem or a novel, he could have also fallen into this game, into this gambit, but he doesn't. He hasn't. And it's true that actually DR Rangraj, to refer to him one more time, he says all these people in the faced with this canon of English literature or these other sorts of world literature, how do you then go about building something like a modern Kannada literature? It was like like little birds who try to hold on to their nests during a storm. So they were doing that there in putting in a certain foundation for literary imagination and I don't think all writers escaped the Vishweshwaraya, the trap. In fact, Masti Venkatesh Iyengar is somebody else in his fiction. As a census commissioner, he's very coolly giving you images of skulls of various people and talking about, sharp noses, and he's also talking about the need to castrate inferior bulls, and he's giving figures of inferior bulls, all of this. So it's the same humanist. Masti is this humanist par excellence in his stories, but as a census commissioner, there is a different mind at work. But I don't think Kuvempu fell into that trap. But I don't want to simply say he escaped it totally. There was a certain kind of neo-Vedantic thought that he did come to accept, and that we know was the colonialism had a lot to do with that, with establishing the Vedantic thought as being of a certain kind. Yeah.
So do you think this road is close to us now forever, of taking local knowledge systems seriously? Because we are so far into the idea of development and everybody has accepted it without ever being asked to justify it. Do you think there's a road open? I like that in the book you say that you're not advocating for a nostalgia or for communities to be sealed off, right? So it's not an insularity. Neither is it a porosity. There is something in the middle. For not just a young person, for somebody who lives in this region right now, what would you say? What would you say about the longing for an elsewhere that still exists in many of us, including in me, in so many ways that are very difficult to even point out? It feels like such a big project to start re-examining it. Where would one start?
Yeah, thank you, Amshyla. I wouldn't start thinking of an alternative at the all India level. That's a trap one should not get into. But there's enormous restlessness all around, I notice, about, the food we eat, about the water we drink, about the weather changing.
The clothes we wear.
There is some sense that something is not quite right. And that could actually be a sentiment, that could actually be conducive to thinking alternatively. I don't want to simply over-idealize the situation. We have a financial system, a share market that's pushing things in a certain way, and the state is, at the national level, even at the state level, is showing no signs of thinking about, we have decentralization, etc., Panchayat Raj, it's all very, it's structurally they're sort of, they're not all that powerful. Having said that, enormous movements across the country it's trying to hold on to local knowledges, either in agriculture or textile traditions. We had a talk on that earlier this morning, in a whole variety of areas. On medicine, medicine is even institutionalized. You have Ayurveda and Unani at some level being given state funding. So I'm sure it's not all lost. I think this is an empirical question, but every state has pockets of resistance of different scales.
Is there an example? I think we are out of time. If you can we can end with an example that we can all hold on to possibly, or think about. I don't think we have time to take questions from the audience, but I'm sure Chandan will be available to speak in the foyer. Just want to end it with an imagination, right, of what it could possibly look like, even a small example.
I don't know. See, if you think paddy cultivation, we all think of paddy fields as fields which have to have water standing there all the time. Otherwise, it's a dry field. But then you had this great experiment in Madagascar by a Catholic priest, where he showed paddy actually doesn't require a whole lot of water to be grown, and the yield is even higher when the water is, the supply is low. And this is a huge success in Odisha and Bihar. We don't know about it in other parts of the country, but this is one example. But I think on the question of solar energy use, there's a certain openness. But how do you then allow it to not become another corporate profit-making entity is the question. I mean, is there some care towards that? There's some thinking about, on bioregional economies across the world. And climate change is definitely making a lot of things that seemed impractical seem actually very practical. Like the push for local level, locally administered things where people get a say in how things are done to them, etc. I think it might it might actually acquire a certain momentum. It shouldn't take a crisis for that to happen, but I don't know.
Yeah, I just want to end on a more hopeful note, I guess.
you.
But I think we are out of time.
Sorry, yeah.
But if the book is available for purchase, it's called Longing for an Elsewhere, Mysore and the Making of India's. Oh, we don't have
Outside
that development state. It's a fantastic book, and thank you for writing it. It has really changed my lens to even how I look at a street in Mysore now.
Oh,
actually,
thank you, Amshyla.
So,
I'm
yeah.
glad, yeah.
Thank you,
Thank you all for being
thanks
here.
everyone.